The sun was rising over Willow Creek, a gated suburban neighborhood just outside of Austin, Texas. The manicured lawns, symmetrical hedges, and identical beige houses made the street look more like a movie set than a place where real people lived. But beneath the perfect exterior simmered resentment, feuds, and whispers, most of which centered around one woman. Karen Whitmore, the iron-fisted president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Karen was 53, divorced twice, and infamous for her sharp tongue and sharper rules. She was the kind of neighbor who would slip HOA fines into your mailbox if your grass was half an inch too tall, or if your trash can lid wasn't properly secured. She thrived on control, and Willow Creek was her kingdom. But for once in her life, Karen wasn't thinking about HOA violations or power plays. She was thinking about love. After years of ruling the neighborhood with an iron gavel, Karen was finally getting married again, to Richard Lawson, a wealthy businessman with a charming smile and the patience of a saint. Richard seemed like the perfect balance to Karen's domineering personality, calm, steady, forgiving. Their engagement had shocked the entire neighborhood, not just because Karen was walking down the aisle again, but because the wedding was to be held right there, in Willow Creek's community park. From the moment she announced her wedding, Karen turned the entire HOA into her personal wedding committee. The invitations were gilded, the flowers imported from California, the band hired from Dallas. No expense was spared. And of course, attendance was mandatory. Residents who tried to politely decline were reminded, via strongly worded HOA emails, that community support was expected. But behind the polite smiles and reluctant RSVPs, the neighbors whispered. Some called it karma waiting to happen. Others just prayed the day would go smoothly, because if there was one thing they knew, it was this. Karen did not handle imperfection well. On the morning of the wedding, the park was transformed into a Pinterest board come to life. White tents with flowing fabric lined the grass, chandeliers hung from oak branches, and rows of gold chairs faced a rose-covered arch. Caterers rushed about with trays of champagne flutes while the band rehearsed soft classical music. Standing at the center of it all, Karen inspected every detail with the precision of a drill sergeant. She barked at the florist for misplacing a centerpiece, scolded a teenager for scuffing the aisle runner, and reminded the photographer, twice, that her good side was the left. Yet beneath her icy control, there was a flicker of nervous excitement. For once, this wasn't about HOA power or reputation. This was about her. This was supposed to be her perfect day. But in Willow Creek, perfection was fragile. And as guests began to trickle into the park, neighbors carrying grudges, secrets, and suppressed laughter, fate had already decided. This wedding would not end the way Karen dreamed. The guests filled the gold chairs one by one, dressed in their finest. But beneath the suits and sundresses lay something electric, almost mischievous. Neighbors exchanged glances, smirks, and whispered commentary under their breath. Everyone in Willow Creek had, at some point, felt Karen's wrath. A notice about their Christmas lights being too tacky. A fine for leaving a basketball hoop in the driveway. A threat of legal action for painting their shutters the wrong shade of beige. Now, gathered for her wedding, there was an unspoken sense of anticipation. Like the air before a thunderstorm. "Bet you $5 something goes wrong," muttered Jacob, a father of 3, to his wife as he straightened his tie. "Something always goes wrong with Karen," she whispered back. "I just hope it's not us this time." The ceremony began late, 15 minutes, then 20, because Karen was furious that one of the bridesmaids' bouquets wasn't uniform enough. By the time she finally appeared, in a glittering ivory gown that clung tightly around her waist, the audience was restless. Still, everyone gasped when she stepped onto the aisle runner. She looked radiant, beaming with self-satisfaction, chin high as though she was about to preside over a board meeting instead of her own marriage. Richard, standing at the rose-covered arch, smiled patiently as Karen approached. The officiant began to speak, his voice carrying over the hum of cicadas and the faint breeze rustling the tents. For a moment, it seemed like the neighborhood gossip had been wrong. Maybe Karen's wedding really would be flawless. And then the first mishap struck. A child in the back row let out a shriek of laughter as he pointed toward the dessert table. The tiered wedding cake, 5 layers tall, covered in buttercream roses, had started to sag to one side under the Texas heat. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen froze mid-step, her eyes narrowing like daggers. "Fix it," she hissed to a caterer, her voice carrying across the entire park. "Now." The officiant tried to steer things back on track, but Karen's glare was fixed on the collapsing cake. By the time she reached Richard at the arch, her jaw was clenched so tightly the muscles in her face twitched. "Let's continue," she said, forcing a brittle smile. But the interruptions didn't stop. Halfway through the vows, a sprinkler system, set on its usual Saturday timer, sputtered to life near the back hedges. A mist of water sprayed across the chairs, soaking the back row of guests. People scrambled, shrieking and clutching their purses. Richard tried not to laugh. Karen did not. "Who didn't check the system?" she snapped, spinning toward her wedding planner. The microphone amplified her rage, echoing across the park. "This is unacceptable." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Phones discreetly lifted, recording the spectacle. For the neighbors who had long lived under Karen's thumb, watching her unravel on her own wedding day was a guilty pleasure too delicious to resist. As the sprinklers sputtered off and the drenched guests tried to dry themselves, Karen turned back to the officiant, her face flushed red. "Keep going," she ordered. Richard gave her a look, half amusement, half concern, but nodded. The ceremony pushed forward. But the spell of perfection was broken. The whispers grew louder. And somewhere in the crowd, someone muttered words that would soon spread like wildfire. "This is karma." The sun hung heavy above Willow Creek Park, baking the gold chairs and wilting the roses on the arch. Karen's carefully lacquered smile was cracking, sweat trickling down her temples. Still, she pressed forward, determined to wrestle this wedding back into the picture-perfect fantasy she'd spent months obsessing over. But the neighborhood wasn't cooperating. The vows had barely resumed when a sharp buzz echoed through the air. Heads turned skyward. A drone hovered above the ceremony, its camera pointed straight at Karen. She froze, her eyes narrowing to slits. "Whose drone is that?" she snapped, her microphone catching every syllable. "This is private property. No unauthorized recordings." The drone dipped lower, circling the arch. Guests craned their necks, whispering and chuckling. Then a voice carried from the back row. "Hey Karen, maybe it's just making sure your grass is HOA approved." Laughter exploded through the crowd. Even Richard chuckled, though he quickly stifled it when Karen's head whipped toward him. Her face was beet red. She signaled to a groomsman, who happened to be her cousin, to handle it. But as he swatted at the buzzing machine with a folding chair, the entire scene dissolved into slapstick chaos. By now, phones were out everywhere. Neighbors who had endured years of Karen's notices and fines were gleefully recording her humiliation. Hashtags were already forming in people's minds. Hashtag Karen wedding fail. Hashtag HOA down. But the drone wasn't the worst of it. The final straw came just as the officiant, voice trembling, tried to continue the vows. Suddenly, a group of teenagers, residents' kids who had been fined countless times for loitering or excessive noise, stormed the ceremony from the park's edge. They carried squirt guns and water balloons, clearly plotting revenge. Before anyone could stop them, a barrage of icy water rained down on the bride and groom. Gasps, then hysterical laughter. Guests leapt from their chairs. The band stopped mid-song. The kids shouted, "This is for the HOA," as Karen screamed in rage, clutching the soaked train of her gown. "How dare you?" "Security!" she shrieked, though there was no security, just stunned caterers and panicked bridesmaids. Richard stood frozen, dripping wet, staring at Karen as though seeing her in a new light. She was wild-eyed, mascara streaking down her face, waving her fists at the fleeing teens. The woman he'd agreed to marry looked less like a radiant bride and more like a dictator whose empire had just collapsed. The cake had melted into a leaning tower, the decorations sagged, the guests laughed openly, and the bride raged like a storm. Then, in the middle of the chaos, Richard did something no one expected. He reached up, tugged off his boutonniere, and laid it gently on the arch. "Karen," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I can't do this." The world went silent. Even the kids stopped laughing. Karen blinked, stunned, as Richard stepped away from her, leaving her alone at the altar. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her voice cracking. "You can't, not today." But he was already walking down the aisle, guests parting around him like the Red Sea. The whispers turned into gasps, then into murmurs of disbelief. The mighty HOA Queen, abandoned on her own wedding day. Karen's scream tore through the park, raw and unfiltered. "Richard, you get back here." But Richard didn't turn back. The neighbors did, though, turning their phones, their cameras, and their quiet, satisfied smiles toward the woman who had ruled their lives for years. Her empire had fallen, and everyone was there to see it. The park was a battlefield. Soggy flower petals stuck to the wet grass. Chairs lay tipped over, and the once regal cake had collapsed entirely, a mound of frosting and sponge oozing across the dessert table. Guests shuffled awkwardly, unsure if they should leave or stay to witness more of the spectacle. But one thing was certain, no one would ever forget what they had just seen. Karen stood at the altar, drenched and trembling, mascara smeared down her cheeks like war paint. The microphone was still clipped to her dress, amplifying the shallow, ragged sound of her breathing. Her eyes darted frantically across the crowd, searching for Richard. But he was gone. He hadn't just walked away. He'd driven off in his black Lexus, tires screeching as he disappeared down Willow Creek Drive. For the first time in years, Karen was powerless. "Go on," she barked at the remaining guests, her voice breaking halfway through. The ceremony's over. A few people moved cautiously, picking up their purses and jackets. Most didn't look at her. Some couldn't suppress their laughter as they walked toward their cars, whispering gleefully about how quickly the videos would go viral. By the time the last of the neighbors left, only Karen remained, standing alone among the wreckage of her dream day. She yanked off the microphone, threw it into the mud, and collapsed into one of the empty chairs. The silence pressed heavy on her chest. For years, she'd controlled every detail of this community. What color the mailboxes could be, how many inches holiday lights could extend from a gutter, when garbage cans were allowed to be placed at the curb. She had built an empire of fear and fines. And now, the same community had watched her lose the one thing she couldn't bully into existence: love. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. Notifications flooded the screen. Karen's wedding disaster faced with tears of joy, hashtag HOA Karma. She finally got what she deserved. HOA Karen ruins her own wedding live. Karen hurled the phone into the grass. The following days were worse. Clips of the ruined wedding spread online like wildfire, racking up views by the millions. National morning shows played the footage of Karen shrieking at the sprinklers, screaming at the drone, drenched in water balloons. She had become a meme overnight, the tyrant HOA president whose own wedding turned into poetic justice. At the next HOA meeting, only 3 residents showed up. The rest had sent in letters demanding her resignation. For once, Karen had no rebuttal, no threats of fines, no power to wield. She signed the papers quietly, her once iron grip on Willow Creek reduced to trembling hands. Weeks later, she drove past the park where her empire had fallen. The grass had regrown, the trees swayed in the breeze. Children played where her aisle had once been. Life had moved on. Only she remained stuck in the wreckage. As she sat in her car, watching the neighborhood she no longer controlled, the truth settled like a weight in her chest. Power couldn't protect her from loneliness. Rules couldn't replace love, and control couldn't guarantee happiness. Karen's wedding hadn't just been ruined. It had exposed the emptiness she'd tried so hard to cover with rules, fines, and perfection. For the first time, the Queen of Willow Creek was just another neighbor, forgotten, humbled, and utterly alone.